Adventurous kids, explore with education and learning what a wild life is in the Everglades. I want to explore the Museum of Discovering Science. What plants do butterflies like? I want to know about Key West. Adventurous kids, learning and fun. Adventurous kids!
Today, I'm going to tell you about St. Augustine. So when most people think about the state of Florida, history is often not the first thing that comes to mind. Typically when we think American history, we think of states like Virginia or Georgia, one of the 13 original colonies. But the truth is there's a lot of history in Florida, particularly around the town of St. Augustine. Now, this video is going to primarily focus on European control of Florida, but it's important to note, and maybe even deserves its own video, that the Timucuan people were living there thousands of years before the Europeans ever settled there. Now, as far as discovering America, remember there were already people living there. Leif Erikson, who was a Norse Viking, did land on the coast of the United States, but they never set up a permanent settlement. The oldest permanent European settlement is St. Augustine, Florida. Most people, for most people in school, history for America begins at Jamestown. That's actually not true. For English control of the Americas, that is true. But as far as other European countries, Florida was the first one settled, and it was settled by the Spanish. So people to know about when you're talking about St. Augustine, there's three major people. There's Ponce de Leon. I like to call him Ponce de la Puffy Pants if you've ever seen pictures of people in the 15 and 1600s. Another person of note is Pedro Menendez de Alvarez, and he was the first governor of Florida. He's the one who created the permanent Spanish settlement here in Florida in the late 1500s. About 20 years before the lost colony of Roanoke in another state, 20 years before the lost colony of Roanoke, and a few years before Jamestown. So the Spanish settled in St. Augustine. They called it La Florida, the flowers, right? Because there's so much nature everywhere. And St. Augustine would trade hands quite a bit in Florida, would trade hands quite a bit in the course of the next 100 years. Spanish controlled for most of it, and the Spanish were responsible for building the Castillo de San Marcos, which is still there today. It's actually what makes the Castillo de San Marcos really unique, aside from the fact that it's still standing and still in pretty good shape for something that old, is that it was made from something called coquina. So they would take shells and they would crush them and they would pressurize it to form a solid rock, which has been described as being impenetrable, which holds true today because it's still there. So in the early 1500s, Ponce de Leon, who was the governor in Puerto Rico, sailed over to what would become Florida. They say it was in search of the Fountain of Youth. It has later been debunked, but there is a very cool Fountain of Youth exhibit that's still there today that is definitely worth checking out, because not only can you look through and get a sip of the water of the Fountain of Youth, but you can also see live demonstrations of cannons and gunfire and how it was back then, because they did find settlement in that area. And then in 1865, Menendez settles St. Augustine in La Florida and claims it for Spain. And then there's a lot of war. And this is where Florida starts to change hands a little bit. So you've got Spain, and then it was English controlled for a little bit, and then they gave it back to Spain, and then something kind of intense happens in America where we say, hey, no taxation without representation. So it went Spanish controlled, English controlled for a little bit, back to Spanish controlled, and then when the United States became the United States and successfully separated from England, the Spanish traded all of Florida to the United States. Now during its time with the United States, something happens in the 1800s, the Civil War. Florida was utilized a little bit, particularly the Castillo de San Marcos during the Civil War, but most of the war was fought above Florida. So it was impacted, but not greatly. In 1705, the Spanish put in the city gates, which was the only way in and out of the city. Those gates still stand there today. Of course, there are other ways in and out of St. Augustine today. So the last person that I had mentioned that was a big part of St. Augustine's history is Henry Flagler. In 1880, Flagler, whose good buddy was one of the Rockefellers, lots of money, settled in St. Augustine and decided to build his grand hotel. He also laid trains all over the state of Florida that helped bring in more tourism, helped bring in more people settling in Florida, and really develop the state. Now those Flagler hotels stand as what we know today as Flagler College, which is a really great college in Florida. It started out as a women's college and is now open to everybody. But I actually have a friend of mine who went to Flagler College and said she really enjoyed the experience, enjoyed going to school in an area that was so rich and full of history. So like much of the rest of the state of Florida, St. Augustine's main commerce is tourism now, especially considering all the history that's there. There's many exhibits and things and experiences you can see. One of my favorite things to do in St. Augustine is visit the Castillo de San Marcos. I believe on either Saturdays or Sundays is one of the weekends days. They do fire a live cannon from the top of the Castillo de San Marcos. They do a live demonstration. There's also the Pirate Museum. There's Ripley's Believe It or Not. There's the oldest schoolhouse, and they just opened up recently the oldest, it's not the oldest house in the Americas, but it's like the oldest, it's one of the oldest houses in America. So the oldest schoolhouse and one of the oldest houses in America. The other thing about St. Augustine, given its rich history, especially with the Temucan people who used to be there, it is considered one of America's most haunted cities. And another fun thing to do if you're going to visit St. Augustine is take one of their ghost tours at night. It's not too scary. I do that with fourth graders when I was teaching, and we used to go for a field trip. So St. Augustine is the oldest European continually occupied city in the United States. And who knew we had so much rich history here in Florida? Thank you for watching this episode of Adventurous Kids.
What did you learn today?
Adventurous Kids!
Adventurous Kids!
What was the most interesting fact?
Adventurous Kids!
Adventurous Kids!
Adventurous Kids!